The house I lived in when I grew up was built by my parents in the early 2000s, which makes this story that I'm about to tell you even more peculiar. When the paranormal activity first started, it seemed to have come from the basement, which at the time, and like most unfinished basements, was kind of spooky. The basement was where we kept our food storage, and the fuse box was down there too. My brother and I were 8 and 6 at the time, and we would avoid the basement at all cost. For some reason, my brother and I seemed to pick up on the energy coming from the basement, and whenever we did have to unfortunately go down there, we'd make sure we always closed the basement door after we left. Not only that, we would close it and lock it, just in case. Like I said, we were young, the basement was spooky, and even then, I think we knew that there was some kind of paranormal activity going on down there. At this point in the life of my family, my father had to travel for business on and off, and when he did leave, he'd end up being gone for weeks at a time. For some reason, we'd notice the activity coming from the basement when he was gone. We'd hear shuffling coming from the stairs in the basement, as well as the door handle slowly rattling in the nighttime. It was like the spirits were afraid of my father or something, and they'd only come out after he left. This had been going on for some time, but this isn't what I would consider the start of the actual paranormal activity. The way that our rooms were situated is that we were at the top of the stairs. At the bottom of those stairs was the basement door. This is how our rooms were set up at the start of all of this activity. I remember the night so clearly that all of this started. I could hear the rattling coming from the basement door, and then I realized that I possibly forgot to lock it. And then my fears were confirmed when I heard the sound of the basement door slowly creaking open. That definitely caught my attention. Whatever it was that was haunting my basement was no longer confined there and was able to enter our home. Things seemed to immediately get worse after that. Doors started to shut by themselves. Footsteps could be heard around the house. Even whispers could be heard at times. We were starting to get so spooked that my parents installed security cameras on all the doors and windows in our house. The security system would alert us if one of those windows or doors opened as well. Initially, this was a great idea, and it gave us a great peace of mind, but little did we know this would only add to the horror of my house. My brother, mother, and myself would often wake up in the middle of the night when my dad was gone, with these alarms blaring because the front door to our home was wide open. These experiences couldn't be chalked up to not locking the door completely, or that a strong gust of wind blew the door open. But still, we tried our best to explain it away. We tried to rationalize everything, but I guess we just didn't want to admit what we all knew was really happening. We started double-checking each other to make sure that the lock was locked and that all the windows were shut too, but the activity still persisted. Eventually, we had 2 more sisters added to our family, and the activity seemed to die down a bit, or we were just too busy to really notice it, and everything seemed to be going pretty well for the first couple of months. Things were going so well that my parents were comfortable enough to cancel the security alerts in our home, because we finally felt at ease in our own home. Many more developments were made with my family. My parents decided to finish the basement, and we actually decided to get a dog. My father was now working from home, and my brother and I practically forgot all the paranormal activity in our house. We even decided to move our rooms into the basement. Thinking back, it could be that my father working at home was what caused all the paranormal activity to stop, because like I said, whatever it was that was haunting our house seemed to be afraid of my father, or at least intimidated enough to not come around while he was there. But anyways, moving our room to the basement proved to be a really horrible idea. The way our basement worked was it was like one of those half basements, or half of it was underground and the other half was able to be accessed by the basement door that you'd have to come through from our backyard. Now, my backyard growing up was terrifying too. It was literally miles of woods. My brother and I actually decided to try to hike all the way through on multiple occasions just to find the nearest town. But we were never able to make it all the way through our backyard. There was just so many trees. And also, I remember once when I was out in the woods and I had to immediately stop because I could actually hear this creepy chanting coming from deep in the woods. That next week, my father came home with a grocery bag full of new DVDs that we were going to watch. In that bag was the movie Paranormal Activity. While watching this movie, one of my sisters, who's now 5 at this time, asked my dad if there were such things as ghosts. But before he could answer, there came a loud boom from the basement. It was so loud it actually shook the entire house, and everybody looked at one another with open mouths and wide eyes. Everyone heard the sound, but also everyone felt it too, and nobody wanted to talk or even move. It was my mother, who doesn't believe in any type of paranormal phenomenon, that was the one that was not completely frozen with fear. She promptly got up, went to the kitchen, and grabbed the largest knife that she could, and then headed down into the basement. None of us were even able to say a word, let alone follow her, because we were just so terrified. After what felt like forever, she finally emerged from the basement, laughing at herself, as well as all of us, and said, "How could you guys actually think that it was actually a ghost that was making noises down there? It was just a box that fell over." We all tried to laugh it off as best as we could, but we were still a little shell-shocked from the experience. Even my dad felt creeped out. And then my brother and I looked at each other with wide eyes, now realizing that both of our rooms were in the very same spot that loud bang came from. It's in my opinion that this movie was able to invite whatever spirits were nearby into our home again, because after that, the activity picked up again, and it was worse than it ever was when I was little. I think the fear that we felt while watching that movie, and the belief that we felt when those things were haunting the other people, actually invited these things back. It opened up a door or something that allowed them to come back to us. When we'd come home from school, the doors to our house would be wide open, and my dog would be losing his mind inside, barking like crazy. One of the more terrifying experiences that I felt there was finding my dog barking upstairs. And when I went to see what my dog was barking at, I came across the attic door that was hanging open from the ceiling. I was the first person to get home. Nobody else was there. Nobody opened the attic. So whatever was haunting our house had to have done it. And my dog was there, barking like crazy, trying to warn us that there was some kind of evil presence up there. I was about 16 at the time, and I had a baseball bat in my hand. I was about to go up there to investigate, but I immediately had the strongest feeling of dread come across my body. It was like my mind was immediately telling me whatever was hiding up in the darkness of that attic wanted to hurt me very badly. I just decided to close the attic stairs, and to this day I still agree with that decision. I didn't know what was up there, but I've seen enough demonic movies to know that you don't go up there investigating in a dark attic. That's how you get possessed. Something new that my family was now experiencing too at this point was what we call peeking. And with that peeking, the activity was ramping up more than ever. Instead of just having doors be opened, we could now catch glimpses of what appeared to be a spirit poking its head around the corners and doorways. We'd often write it off as just tricks of the light or our eyes playing tricks on us, until we started to realize that the more this happened, the more defined the spirit appeared to be. It was like the more we paid attention to it, and the more we knew it was there, the better it could manifest itself. It even got to the point where we could actually see red eyes peering back at us. At this point, we decided to call a church member to come over and bless the home. When this happened, most of the activity went away for a while, but that's also when my dreams started to become a lot more vivid and a lot more violent. In my dreams, I would often see these 3 figures that were covered in shadows coming from the backyard and into my house. 2 of the figures felt kind of indifferent about me and didn't really seem that harmful, but the third one was completely hostile. All I could feel was pure hatred and evil just rolling off of this thing. And even in my dream, I could tell that it wanted to hurt me, and that terrified me. This figure also seemed especially drawn to me, and it emitted such strong emotions that I often debated whether or not it was a spirit at all, or if it was some other kind of demonic being, really. To make things worse, I'd often wake up and find a figure standing in my doorway, and then just vanishing. I remember the most terrifying experience of my life was once waking up during sleep paralysis, and I saw the three figures standing over me near my bed. The hostile one had something coming out of its mouth, and it was completely covering my face. At first, I thought it was trying to eat me or something, but then I realized what it was doing. It wasn't taking anything away from me. It was giving me something. It was giving me thoughts and feelings that weren't mine. During that sleep paralysis, one of the other figures leaned over to the other two and said, "I think this one can see us." I remember immediately waking up from that dream to find my bed was actually shaking. These kind of events continued until I graduated high school and moved on to college. I still have some side effects from the experience, and I've had roommates tell me that I often shake and scream in the night. Two things that make these experiences the most terrifying for me is no one died on our property, as far as I know. Our house was built by my parents, and nobody died in there. So, where did the spirits come from? Did they come from the woods where I heard that creepy chanting? Or were they attached to something or someone else, and they ended up stuck in our home? Or were they haunting the forest and could come into the house? The second point that I'd like to make was that the activity never actually stopped. My family just happened to move away. So for all I know, that house is still rife with activity. I just hope that whoever lives in the house now doesn't have to experience what I had to. Before I start this, I need to make this clear. I was 11 years old at the time, and I was a very plain and uninteresting guy all around. I hadn't had any other experiences before or since with any type of creature or the paranormal. One other thing is that this lasted an entire week while it was happening. What I'm about to tell you lasted from Monday all the way to the next Sunday. This happened to me over 8 years ago. I was in 6th grade at the time, and it was about midway through the year. We were all stressed since the dreaded midterms were upon us, and honestly, none of us were prepared. So all of our minds were completely addled from the random questions that we were going to have to answer on the test. The day went by as uneventful as usual, except for the teachers telling us to get ready and whatnot. School ended, and I decided I was going to do anything that night to relax, thanks to the annoying teachers constantly pestering us about those tests. I went home and watched some TV, and a few movies later, it was time for me to go to bed. This is the first night that everything started. My mom tucked me into bed since I was a complete mama's boy, and I was trying to go to sleep after she shut the door. Soon after that, I heard the TV downstairs turn on, telling me that my mom had sat down to watch some TV. I tried to go to sleep, but something was just off. No sooner had I heard her turn the TV on, I stopped hearing it. Actually, I stopped hearing any other noise coming from downstairs too. This would usually be chalked up to my mom just going to bed. However, she always turned the lights off. I could tell she hadn't gone to bed because I could still see all the lights from underneath my door. The part that really scared me is that I realized I couldn't hear anything at all. It was like I'd suddenly gone deaf. As I wondered why I no longer could hear her, or anything for that matter, I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. Scared, I tried to get up and move, or call for help, or do anything to get someone's attention, but I found I couldn't move, or make any kind of sound at all. Regardless of how hard I tried, my mouth would open, but nothing would come out. I strained to move, but it felt like my muscles had been paralyzed. They wouldn't respond to what my brain wanted them to do. As I laid there, trying to get someone's attention, that's when I first saw it. There it was by the closet door. This thing. It was large, but not muscular, and it was actually very skinny. I thought I could almost see the bones protruding from underneath the skin. Its height is what startled me, though. It startled me from the very get-go. It was probably 6 or even 7 feet tall, but it was still clinging to the door, and it was hunched over slightly so it wouldn't hit the ceiling. It had very pale skin, but I couldn't make out any details on it exactly. Not that night, anyways. The last thing I noticed was that it didn't have a face. It was just a blank slate, devoid of any features and devoid of any kind of hint as to why it was there or what it was. I looked at this thing with a feeling that I would only imagine is a primal instinct that you feel when you look into something like this that you can't explain. It was absolute fear. Not the kind of fear you get when you see your parents get into a fight, or the kind of fear you get when you look at a predator like a bear or a wolf. This was what I would imagine is the kind of fear you feel when you know that your life is at stake and something that you can't even explain could kill you in an instant. Something was just horribly wrong about this situation. This thing, whatever it was, stayed there on the door for hours. It never moved, not even an inch. It just stayed there and did nothing, just like how I could do nothing. As the hours passed, I managed to be able to think to some degree, and I realized I had no idea what I was going to do. Mom would come in at 6:30 to wake me up, and this thing was still there, not making a sound or movement. The time was starting to draw near to when she was supposed to come wake me up, and now I began to panic. What if this thing attacked my mom? I tried to move, but I was still in that paralyzed state. I tried to scream again, but still nothing would come out. I could see under the door, and I noticed that a shadow was moving. I realized that my mom was walking up the stairs and towards my door. I still couldn't do anything. I wanted to scream to her to warn her that there was a monster in the room. But as the door swung open, I glanced at it, and then when I looked back at the closet, this thing was gone. It vanished without a trace, in an instant. When it was gone, I felt like I had control over myself again, though, except for one thing, and that being this strange feeling that I shouldn't tell anyone what happened. I just knew that I needed to keep my mouth shut about it, or something bad could happen. When my mom opened the door, she saw me and asked why I looked so pale. I just told her I had a nightmare. She seemed like she understood, or at the very least, she thought she did. She came over to me and told me it was all right, and that monsters weren't real. I really wish that was true. I just spent all night with one staring at me. I even went to school like normal, and I actually forgot about what happened that night. School ended, and I got home. I went outside to walk around the neighborhood. I was back home before dinner. I guess I was so scared I pushed it out of my brain and tried to forget about it. Maybe it was my way of keeping myself safe. I went upstairs to go to bed that night, and having completely forgotten about it, or at least written it off as a bad dream, I tried to go to sleep again. But that night, it came back. This time was almost the same as the night before. It started by me losing all my hearing, and then I couldn't speak, and finally I was unable to move a muscle. And again, same as before, that thing appeared. The only difference was its position. Now it was further down the door, with his knees bent backwards. It was crossing its arms, which I could tell from this new angle had claws on the ends of them. This thing was now looking right at me, or at least pointed in my direction. Once again, it stood, silent and unmoving. This time, I didn't even try to do anything. I just looked at it, and I waited for it to do something. Anything. I waited and I waited, but thankfully, it didn't do anything once again. Leaving in a similar fashion as the night before. This time, when I left home after I woke up, I got to school and I did not forget about it. As the day passed, all I could think about was that thing. It's like it wouldn't leave my head. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there. I hadn't seen any horror movies in the last 3 months, and school was not stressing me out that bad. So this had to be a legitimate haunting, or quite possibly even a stalking. I don't know. I still don't have an answer for it to this day. But this happened every night, and the only things that changed each night were its position towards me and how far away from me it was. The third night, it left the door and positioned itself on the floor in between the door and my bed. It looked like it was squatting, like it was trying to imitate a frog or preparing to launch itself into the air towards me, with its claws extended. Luckily, it never did. On the fourth night, that primal fear almost went away. However, this thing got even closer, even peeking its head over the edge of my bed with its hand actually on the bed. The next day after that, I tried to see if it would leave some kind of mark on the floor or by my bed, but there was nothing. That night, it was at the edge of my bed all night long with its hand on my bed. But there was still no print on my sheets or anything like that. Night 5 came, and now it was crouched on the edge of my bed, being careful that it was not touching any part of the bed that I occupied with my legs. It was just perched right there at the end of the bed. Night 6 came and it was no longer on my bed, but it was extremely close on the wall to my left. It was holding a position that looked like it was staring away from me at one of my toys or maybe some other object. But again, it never moved a muscle. Now, before I talk about the last night, which is the hardest and most uncomfortable part for me to write about, let me say that I had tried to block it from getting any closer each day before I went to bed. I'd put coats in the closet, which I guess made it leave the door. I tried to put a chair in between me and it from where it was the night it moved, but it ended up pushed close to the edge of my bed. Needless to say, I stopped trying after that, thinking I was inciting it to get closer each time. Maybe if I ignored it, it would just go away. But how could I ignore this thing staring right at me, so close to me every single night? This thing that, for all I knew, crawled out of the depths of hell to stalk me. And then the final night, it got close. And by close, I mean it made sure its face was only a few inches from mine. It was so close I couldn't even see behind it. It used its arm and a leg on the wall to hold itself up, and the other arm was on the wall behind me, and the other leg was holding onto the right side of my bed. Not only was this thing positioning itself around me in a way that resembled a spider surrounding a bug in its web, but there was also something else that was different about that night. This was the first night I realized I had control over myself. I could feel that I could move if I wanted to, or make a move if I tried. I could even hear the TV downstairs still playing, and my mom talking to my stepdad. But I still couldn't talk. Even with this revelation, though, I made no attempt to do anything. As I looked up at this thing, it was so close I could tell that it actually did have a face. However, the mouth, eyes, and what I think was a nose were all located behind this sheet of skin. That's also when I noticed that it was smiling at me. And it was smiling at me with these jagged, sharp teeth. I felt like it knew I could move, and it almost seemed like it was daring me to try. I didn't take up that challenge, though. I just waited like I usually did, and I now had a fresh wave of that primal fear fall over me. It was just like I felt those first 2 nights. This thing had no smell, and still didn't make a sound. I had a thought that this thing was made for the sole purpose of getting into a house and leaving no trace behind. As it continued to just smile and make no movement or noise. I lost track of how many hours had actually passed since I went to bed and this thing came back to me. At some point, I realized that my mom was again coming up the stairs to wake me up. And when I noticed, so did that thing. It smiled wider. It was the only movement this thing had ever made so far. As the sound of the footsteps got closer, I saw it disappear and then reappear before my very eyes. It was like it just evaporated out of existence and then reappeared. It went from going point blank on top of me to being on the top of the door that my mom was about to open. She opened it, and this time that thing didn't leave. It made one final movement. It was a quick, yet slow motion movement of this clawed hand going over its mouth. It looked like it was telling me to stay quiet. And then, it disappeared from my sight again. After it left, I didn't say a word about it for months, almost a year actually. I didn't want to take a chance of it coming back. I finally told my mother what had happened, and all she said to me was, "Don't worry, nothing in this house will ever hurt you." This should seem like a normal response for a mother to make, but I could have sworn that I could see her go a little pale after I told her. I was wondering for the longest time if she meant that there was actually nothing in the house, or if there was nothing in the house that could hurt me, even though she knew that there was actually something in the house. I knew that there was something in the house, and it could very well hurt me. But it never came back. After all these years, I still have no idea what it was. I've been told by some people that it was just my mind going into overdrive because of stress, but even my mind could never create something as horrific as that. I've told other people since then, and some say it was a demon that was there to feed off my fear. I've researched what it could be, but I've never come up with anything solid because nothing I find matches the description. Nothing I can find has a face behind its skin. So to this day, I still wonder, what was it? Why did it decide to stay around for so long and just do nothing? Was it really a demon? Or was it some other type of horrific creature? Or was it in fact just a figment of my imagination that lasted an entire week? One day, I hope to find the answer to this, but I have a feeling it won't be for a long time. Call me crazy, but I don't feel like I've seen the last of this thing either, and that it might eventually come seeking me out again, only next time it won't just stay there and wait for me to do something. My name is Veronica. I'm 31 years old now and have a great family. I had an experience when I was little that I would like to tell you about, and hopefully it'll end up on your channel. I'd really like to get the opinions from you and your subs, since you seem to do a lot of research into the things that your clients witness. I'll start by telling you the story of what happened to me. Then I'll tell you what I think it was that I encountered. Hopefully, you can shed some light on it either way. When I was growing up, I was an army brat. We moved around a lot following my father, and we stayed in places like Germany, Ireland, and France. I didn't mind it at all. I liked seeing new places, and I got to homeschool, so the curriculum was basically whatever my folks wanted. We stayed at some pretty cool places too. Usually, if we couldn't stay with my dad, we would stay with a family that was kind enough to let us in. And usually, that meant staying with an old spinster or a widow in a cottage in the middle of nowhere. I guess that's just how it happened. When these events happened to me, we were staying in Germany with one of those little old ladies I was talking about. It was 2001, I was 11 years old, and it was around March of that year. My dad had been relocated to Berlin a month before we arrived, and when we got there, we got to spend an evening with him, until it was time for him to do whatever it was that he did, and we went to meet the lady that'd be putting us up while we were in Berlin. One thing I should say, is that I never really knew what my dad was up to or why we moved around so much. I just knew we did move around a lot, and he had the clearance or privilege of being able to let us tag along to most of those places. Anyways, my mom and I got to the cottage after dark, and we were met by this sweet little lady named Hannah. She looked like she was in her late 60s or maybe early 70s. She'd been a widow for years, and actually had a son in the armed forces that knew my father, hence the availability of staying with her at her house. Even better, she spoke perfect English, which made our lives so much easier. The one drag about moving around a lot is if you ended up in a country where English wasn't the primary language, sometimes there was a barrier and you didn't really know what people were saying. But luckily, with Hannah, that wasn't the case at all. I was even able to have my own room, and I quickly unpacked the suitcases that I brought. I had a few books that I took with me everywhere, some toys that still had some sentimental value, and of course, another suitcase full of clothes. I think part of the excitement of moving so much was being able to set up a new room so often. This one had a small loft at the top of some stairs that would be my room. It had a big window at the front of the house, and it was a nice view of the area around us. I couldn't see any other houses, just a lot of trees. Everything was just grand for the first week we stayed there. Berlin was beautiful, and Hannah was a great cook and a very nice hostess. But then one night, everything changed, including the way that I view the world. I know it sounds kind of cliche to say that, but what I saw shook the foundations of my belief, and it made me question what kind of things are really out there. I had an imagination back then, sure, but I knew what was make-believe, and I knew monsters were make-believe. Well, guess what? I was dead wrong. Part of why I didn't believe in these things was the simple fact that I'd never experienced anything paranormal before. I remember lying there with my back to the big window, thinking about kid stuff, and I heard this noise that sounded kind of like a dry moan or something, like someone was in desperate need of a glass of water. It sounded like it was coming from behind me, which was weird because I was facing the stairs and my back was to the window. I quickly rolled over in bed and I looked around, but there was nothing there. I chalked it up to my imagination, or that I was dozing off and had imagined it, and rolled back over. I must have fallen asleep because a few hours later, I remember waking up. I was awake instantly and terrified for some reason. It was like I knew something was wrong, and I had this instinct that was trying to warn me. I was actually shaking because I was so scared. I turned around in bed again, and I was able to catch the curtains falling back into place. I felt really foolish. I thought the window was open, and that's why I heard something earlier, and it was probably just something outside. That would also be why the curtains were moving, because of the wind. I got out of bed, laughing at myself, and went to shut the window. But I was shocked to find the window was closed. And in fact, there wasn't even a way to open the damn thing. I went back to bed, slightly unnerved, and I sat there for a good couple of minutes, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But when nothing did, I laid back down and went to sleep. Or I tried to go back to sleep anyways, because that hoarse whisper sounded off again. This time, I jumped out of bed and ran to the stairs, only stopping at the top of them because I felt dumb for running. I should have listened to those instincts. That's my advice for anyone listening to this. Always trust your instincts. If they tell you that something's wrong, or dangerous, or just the simple fact that you shouldn't be where you are, listen to them and get the hell out of Dodge. I sat back down on the bed, looking around, told myself it was ridiculous that I had had a nightmare and that now my imagination was getting the best of me, and I laid back down. No sooner did I do that, though, that I heard that noise again. And then another noise. But this time, it wasn't a hoarse whisper. It was like a sobbing moan. But it was so quiet it was barely audible. When I turned around to look at the window again, I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. I don't know if you've ever had one of those dreams where you're so terrified that you try to talk and all you can do is kind of whisper at the edge of your breath, and your eyes tear up, and you shake. That's what happened to me, but it wasn't during a dream. This was really happening. This was a reality that I was facing right now. Because there was this woman there, or at least, I think she was a woman. She was so ugly. Wrinkles all over her face. Her face looked burnt, and her skin was cracking in several places, and you can see the flesh underneath that. She had black hair, but only on the sides of her head. The top looked bald and burnt. The hair was long and stringy. She had one ear that was pointed, but the other was deformed, and both of them stuck out of that nasty, stringy hair. She had tattered rags for clothes, and they just hung around her body because she was so skinny. They were a gray color and had several tears in them. She also had no shoes. She looked like she appeared right out of the shadows in the corner of the room, and she was moving closer to me with one hand stretched towards me. Her hand was all curled and deformed too, but there was definite claws on her crooked fingers. I tried to scream again, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe, actually, and kept taking these short, terrified breaths. I tried to get up and run, but this woman had some kind of power over me that made it impossible. She reached the bed and was staring down at me. I remember the tears in my eyes, but I couldn't even make sounds enough to cry, and the tears started to blur my vision. She spoke to me, but it was in that same hoarse language that I heard before. I don't even know if she was speaking any language known to man. It wasn't English. It wasn't German either. I have no idea what she was saying. And just like those sobbing moans, these whispers that she was telling me were barely audible. And then, like saving grace, Hannah came up the stairs, asking if I was up because she had heard something. The thing standing over me looked up at her and actually snarled, and I saw this mouth full of gross, rotting teeth. They weren't sharp, they looked pretty human, but they were definitely rotting, and they had this sickening black color to some of them. And then, whatever this thing was, backed away and vanished into nothingness. I'm talking, she actually faded away, right in front of us. And when she did that, it was like that power that she had over me evaporated. I bolted up, crying, and I raced to Hannah, who hugged me tight and asked if I was okay. I clung to her and just cried, because I still couldn't find my voice enough to talk. I just buried my head into her and cried, until my mom came up. She'd been woken up from the commotion, and she came to comfort me too. I told them all about what had happened, but of course, my mom thought I was having a very vivid nightmare. Hannah didn't really say much about it though. She just seemed to watch me, very thoughtfully. The next day, she actually ended up hanging some kind of charm next to the window in that loft, and a few others around the house, mainly the doors. She told me it was to protect the thresholds of her home from evil spirits. I did not want her to elaborate. I was still traumatized from what had happened, and I thought to myself that maybe the thing that I encountered really was an evil spirit. I asked her if she actually believed me, and if she believed in that kind of stuff, and she just gave me this little smile and a wink, and I knew that she believed in what I saw. I think her charms worked, because we stayed in that cottage for 4 months after that, and I never experienced that thing again. There's sometimes that I think my mom might have been right, that it was just a dream, but I know deep down that it wasn't. It couldn't have been. There was no time in that entire situation that I felt like I was asleep, and when Hannah came up to the loft, I was already awake. That thing was still there when she came up, and I know they locked eyes with each other. Hannah looked extremely surprised when she saw that thing, and actually jumped backwards at the sight of it. So I know she saw something too. I did a lot of research after that, trying to find out what it was that I saw, or at least find other people that have had kind of the same encounter. And I've come to the conclusion that what I encountered that night was a night hag. The description and the encounter match with one almost perfectly. I was paralyzed. It was this ugly entity that resembled an old woman. It came to me at night, and it had that power over me. Plus, it appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye, without using a door or a window, or even walking. Because when she was coming at me, she actually seemed to float. She didn't make walking movements. It was more of a glide across the room. What do you think it was? Do you think I'm right? Or do you think it's something else? Or do you think my worst fear, that I imagined it all, and I'm crazy? I've never seen anything else paranormal since then, and I pray to God that I never do. I haven't told my children about this encounter. I think they're too young. And I pray that they never encounter anything like that either. We kept in touch with Hannah until she passed away. It was actually a very emotional time for me because we'd got to know her really well, and she was part of our extended family. And when she passed away, I actually thought about asking her son if I could have those charms that she had around the house, if he ever found them. I took great comfort in those things the whole time we were there, and I wish I knew more about them. I can't even really remember what they look like at this point in my life, but they kind of resembled a dream catcher, only they were metal and not as big. If anybody knows what I'm talking about that's listening to this, I would sure appreciate the help identifying the charms, because maybe I could find some and place them around my house, just in case. But again, I would like to know everybody's opinion on what I saw. Does anybody agree with me out there that it was a night hag that I encountered that night? Or do you have any other theories on what else it could be? I moved into this old house after a particularly nasty divorce. I mean, he got everything. The house, the car, the bank accounts, everything. I was pissed and bitter, and I wanted answers. Because of all that, I did something stupid. I blame myself for what happened next. You see, I was stupid enough to use a Ouija board. From what I learned, I woke something up, something that was already there. But I only learned this after all the crazy shit happened to me. It wasn't happy about being woken up either. Things I've read, people talk about this gradual pickup in activity. Once they use the Ouija board, subtle things start happening at first. Maybe your keys, or a TV remote, or something like that, ends up in some wacky place. Maybe you feel a cold spot, or hear a whisper. No, this wasn't like that for me at all. It was quick, and it was aggressive. But anyway, back to the Ouija board. It was me and my brother-in-law. My sister was there too, but she refused to use the damn thing. And she warned us that nothing good ever comes from using them. Both of us laughed her off. We lit some candles and started asking questions. We talked to this guy named Thomas. He said he took his own life. I told my brother-in-law to stop screwing around, but he swore to me that it wasn't him. That was enough for both of us, and we stopped. You see, he thought I was moving the planchette. I thought he was moving it. But, for real, true to life, as true as I'm standing here right now, recording this for you, neither one of us were moving that damn thing. This ghost, Thomas, was moving it himself. After that, we got a bunch of I told you so's from my sister. I told her to shut up. We put the Ouija board away and tried not to think anything else of it. Eventually, a few hours later that night, and after a vast amount of liquor, they went home. As soon as they were gone, it felt like the activity started. I got these chills. I could feel the temperature change in the room. I tried to ignore it. I tried to blame it on the imagination of myself and all the liquor that was in my veins right then. So I started to clean up. Then I saw a glass fall off the counter, as clear as day. I'm not talking it slipped off of the counter and fell. I'm not talking about I bumped it. I wasn't even in the same area. This thing looked like somebody grabbed it and slid it right off of the counter. It fell to the ground and shattered. I took off. I ran to my room, shut the door, and called my sister, telling her what I just saw. Again, a bunch of I told you so's. After a while, I managed to fall asleep. With the lights and the TV on, I might add. I kept talking to myself, trying to psych myself up, saying that maybe it really was my imagination. Maybe there was a gust of wind or something. I mean, it was storming that night, and I did have a window open, but this is a heavy glass. It's not just gonna fall off of the counter because of a gust of wind. But nonetheless, after a few hours, I fell asleep. I woke up in the morning with one hell of a hangover, I might add, and I was hoping it was just a bad dream. But when I went out into the kitchen, the broken glass proved otherwise. Then I hoped it was my imagination again, combined with all the alcohol. But sadly, it wasn't. All of these encounters I'm about to talk about happened at night. Never once had any encounter happen during the day, from the time they started until the time they stopped. They always happened after the sun went down. I started seeing things moving out of the corner of my eye. Shadows darting around. Sometimes they'd go around a corner, sometimes they'd dart into another room. I'd get glimpses of something going around the corner that looked like either a flowing black dress or maybe long black tendrils. I'm not sure, and it sure as hell was scary. If it was something that had tendrils, what the hell could that be? One morning, I woke up at about 5 a.m. to this burning sensation on my stomach. When I looked, I saw these scratch-like fingernail claws across my belly. There was 3 of them. This was more than I can handle, and I started to cry. I talked to whatever it was that was out there, and said I was sorry for using the Ouija board. I was sorry for stirring it up, and I begged it to leave me alone. But it didn't. In fact, that was only the first of many attacks. I've been pushed, bitten, scratched, even slapped. One time when I was walking into my room, I felt something slap me right in the back. Again, I started to cry. You see, I'm a woman that lives alone. I have a ghost in my house. As far as I know, it could be something malignant, or not even a human presence at all. What if it was a demon? What if whatever it was that was talking to us wasn't really a man named Thomas? What if it was something that you could conjure up from the depths of hell, and it was tormenting me? I called my sister again, and we prayed over the phone. We prayed for protection. We prayed that this thing would leave me alone. We prayed that this thing would leave entirely. But it still didn't. One night, I woke up with pressure on my chest, Like someone was pressing down on me. And that was just the first time that happened. Waking up with the pressure on me happened probably a dozen times. And there was nothing I could really do about it, besides the occasional slumber party over at my brother-in-law and my sister's house. I was in a lease. I couldn't break that lease, or I would have to pay one hell of a fine. So I was stuck there, with my roommate from hell. I spent a lot of nights sleeping on the couch at my sister's house. But I knew that that was only a temporary solution, and eventually, I'd have to go back to my house and encounter that thing again. One time my mom came over, and she only stayed about 10 minutes. She got sick as soon as she walked in. Physically sick, dizzy, and nauseous. She said that something wasn't right here, and she needed to leave, and she begged me to go with her. To humor her, I went out and had dinner with her. We spent a few hours at that table talking about what I had seen. She wanted me to move in with her. But again, I reminded her about my lease and that I couldn't break it. I wasn't in a financial position to do that, especially after that bastard took all the money that I had. But my mom, she wasn't the only person to get sick like that. 2 other friends and a date that I brought home all got sick and freaked out too. They said something was in that house and they could feel it. Something hostile, and that it didn't want them there. So they grabbed their shit and they left without any more explanation than that. Numerous times, food would taste rotten or spoiled. I'd bite into a steak that I'd just cooked or pour myself a glass of juice, and they tasted disgusting, like they'd been sitting in the fridge for months and months, when, in fact, they weren't anywhere near their expiration date. It got to the point where I wouldn't even sleep at night. I would only sleep during the day, because I was afraid of being attacked again. And by this point, I knew that the attacks would only come at night. Whatever it was in my house would only come at night. This, plus the fact that I saw a face in my window, kept me up all night long. The time I saw a face in the window, I was outside taking the garbage out, and when I was walking back up, I saw someone looking out the window of the living room. Someone I didn't know. He looked old and pale. He had short white hair and a blue jean jacket on. And I could see right through him. My cousins were over that time. I ran into the house to tell them. They swore nobody was there. They were in the same room that I saw the man in, at the same time, and yet they still didn't see anything. Could this thing really make itself visible to one person and invisible to other people? This was really starting to get me down. Physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I went to church every Sunday. I talked to my priest and told him about what I had seen. He said I needed to trust in the Lord, that I was strong enough to fight this evil, and that eventually, good would come, and whatever it was that was tormenting my house would be vanquished. I know all of this sounds crazy, but everything I'm telling you actually happened. But anyway, back to the night that I saw the man in the window. You bet your ass, I made both of my cousins stay the night with me that night. And, to top it off, they were so scared, they both slept in my room with me. We stayed up till the wee hours of the morning, hoping that we wouldn't have another encounter. Well, I was hoping that I wouldn't have another encounter. They were hoping that they wouldn't see anything at all. And luckily their wish came true, because nothing else happened that night. Needless to say though, after that, you can imagine how difficult it was to sleep. Not only was I being physically attacked, but now I had seen what was doing it. A pissed off old man, and there was still nothing that I could do about it. That's when I started staying up all night long. Man, that did wonders for my life, especially my work ethic. My performance got worse and worse. I started sleeping during the day, before and after work. But while I was at work, I'd be really exhausted. Until one day, my boss called me in and fired me. He said he was sorry, but my performance had gone down the shitter, and he had to let me go. I didn't blame him. I mean, I would have fired me too. But that just made things worse. It seemed things picked up after that. The wispy shadows were seen more and more often, and this feeling of dread was always in the house. I'd be fine when I wasn't there, but the moment I would step foot through that doorway, I'd get this feeling like something was always wrong. I'd had enough, and I contacted a medium. We exchanged emails about what to do and what was going on, and she finally agreed to come over to my house and get readings for me. When she came, she confirmed that I did in fact have an entity in my house. Well, no shit, I could have told you that. She told me it was human, but it was very, very mad. And he did indeed commit suicide in the house that I was living in. He didn't want me there. He wanted me to leave. When I heard her say that, when I thought to myself, this pissed off poltergeist is actually trying to evict me because he couldn't deal with his life, and now he's so pissed off still that his afterlife is being plagued and he's tormenting me. Well, that really pissed me off, and I decided right then and there I wasn't going anywhere. In fact, it was time to fight back. I asked her what we could do and how to get this thing out of my house, and she told me we can do a cleansing. She did that. She told Thomas to leave, and I repeated after her that he wasn't welcome here, that he needed to leave. If he couldn't deal with me being there, and he wouldn't be hospitable with me, he needed to get the hell out of my house, because he was dead, and I was still alive, and I had a lot of living left to do. And this time, I was taking hold of my own life and getting him out of there. We prayed several times. She repeated herself a lot. Now, I don't mean to sound sarcastic or ungrateful, because I really am thankful. I just don't know how else to describe what we did. There was a lot of praying and a lot of telling him to get lost. But anyways, it worked. Thomas left. The first couple of weeks, though, I was still uneasy. I kept figuring I would see him darting around a corner, or he would slap me, or bite me, or make himself known to me again. But he never did. As I waited for another assault or encounter, the burden that I was feeling slowly lifted off of me. The weight of the dread that I would feel every single time I walked through that door dissipated. My tormentor was gone, and I was happy. I had my life and my home back. I stayed another 2 years in that house and never had another encounter. What I witnessed and what I went through definitely made me a believer, and it convinced me to never ever mess with a Ouija board again, as long as I live. In fact, I burnt that damn thing. Every time somebody talks about a Ouija board now, I tell them exactly what I encountered, and I recommend that they don't play with it, because even though I encountered a ghost, they might encounter something a little more evil, like a demon. Most of the time they believe me. I get a lot of "you're kidding me's" or "no ways," and I tell them that everything that I told them, just like I'm telling you now, is completely true. Ghosts and demons and Ouija boards are really, really real. So for everybody listening, I recommend you stay away from the damn things. It could be as easy as getting one from a toy store. I got mine from a Walmart. They were selling it during Halloween, and I thought, hey, My life sucks right now. Maybe I could talk to the dead and get some answers, and they can point me in the direction that I'm supposed to go. But all it did was make my life miserable, until I took hold of it again and told those entities that were bugging me to piss off. So for everybody out there, God bless and good luck. Because like the supernaturalist says, things really do go bump in the night. Have a good night. And thank you for listening to my story. And once again, God bless. The year I turned 14 was the last year that I would be permitted to attend my favorite summer sleepaway camp, St. George's. The camp is located in Orkney Springs, Virginia, a sleepy little unincorporated community entirely centralized around the existence of the Orkney Springs Hotel, which is an old and notoriously haunted retreat destination. It was built in the early 19th century, then restored in the 70s after ownership changed, and there is, to this day, a stagnant quality of time in Orkney Springs, which contributed greatly to the mood of the camp. Everything seems to have a frozen effect. Antique relics from the hotel's early history on display behind velvet ropes, old southern recipes from the same line of moon ma women pumping hearty fare out of the communal kitchen, and the same rusty, dangerous elevator which campers were chastised to never play on, leading up to a haunted ballroom in 70s decor. The camp is owned by an Episcopal diocese, and so, subsequently, we shared it in timeless sights, sounds, and smells of that place, forever caught in a long-ago decade. Being 15 is a fussy age. A little too old to enjoy macaroni art or tie-dye shirts or sing-alongs without the first hint of self-conscious discomfort. You know, the discomfort that comes with puberty. At 14, I was still content with these things, though, although they admittedly were already beginning to lose a little of their succour. As a camp senior, the option was given to me to pick one of 3 big 3-day wilderness excursions: canoeing, hiking, or rock climbing. I chose canoeing, and with 10 campers and 3 counselors, we departed in a van with our boats for what I now assume was the south branch of the Potomac River. We would be crossing over to West Virginia at some point, though it was often the case. The joke goes that St. George's, that you can pick blueberries in Virginia and take a pee in West Virginia, all in the same 5 minutes. The first day out, we passed boats with hunters as our canoe dragged lazily through the reedy deep in the river. They were the kind of West Virginian hunters that you see in horror films. You know, the kind with 3 teeth, overalls over bare skin, and big old bloodhounds piled in the wet next to them in their busted canoes. They cracked piss beer out of styrofoam coolers and spoke in a dialect so thickly garbled that I doubt even the counselors knew what they were saying. I do remember one counselor holding out a map in front of us and attempting to ask questions. The second day back out on the water under the burning hot sun, the counselor told us we were lost. Naturally, we were all upset, but they reassured us that as long as we followed the river, eventually we would come out on the other end near something familiar. Looking back now as an adult, I realize how these young counselors must have actually been so scared and confused. And I still wonder at their training. The youngest might have been 17, the oldest in his early 20s. But I was 14 then, so I didn't really think anything of it. With little choice other than to just agree and keep rowing, we kept on moving. That afternoon, we pulled up on an unknown pebbly bank in order to make camp. A recent flood had torn debris from the riverbanks and washed it up on the shore as far up and down as the eye could see. All along the edge of the clearing, we found natural teepee formations made of mangled tree trunks and wild, snarling branches. We dragged our canoes up the rocks to tuck them beside the trees, and I remember tiny waves of frogs fleeing in front of us in the green tide, and one big fat toad that flopped on my boot toe and wouldn't leave. Later, while hunting for a suitable girl's latrine spot, I went inside one of those natural teepee formations and discovered the bloody skeleton of poached raccoons hanging wetly above. The blood hadn't completely dried yet, and their tails were still intact, fluffy in the breeze. A snuffed-out fire pit was directly below that, and I thought of the men with 3 teeth and their dogs in the boats. That night, we ate and sang camp songs and had s'mores and looked at the stars. After dark, for a briefly frightening time, a certain moaning noise began to intermittently come out of the woods. Our counselors quickly rushed to reassure us that the sounds were from cows, and that we must be camped on the very edge of a farmer's grazing property. We quickly accepted this and went on. The girls went to tarp their corner, yards away from the counselors that slept in their tents, and the boys' tarp sat on the farthest side of our grounds. I woke up deep into the night with a mighty need to pee. I climbed out of the pile of snoring teenage girls, grabbed a flashlight and the bathroom kit, and ambled into the trees to find a perfect spot. I don't remember being at all afraid in that particular moment, mostly interested in satisfying my bladder by emptying it. I was calm enough that when I encountered a strange figure a few minutes into my walk, I stopped, just assuming it was one of my fellow campers. About 10 feet from me, sitting on a broad, flat rock, was a young boy. He looked about my age, 14, maybe a weak 16. His head was buzzed and his hair looked pale, maybe blonde. It was cold outside in a way that only mountains can be at night, and yet he wasn't wearing a shirt. He was a little cave-chested, and he sat with one elbow propped up on his knee, barefoot in tattered acid-wash jeans. He was smiling just a little, and looking directly at me. My first inclination was anger. I thought at first glance that this was Alex, one of the boys camping with us, who worked picking corn with his father. I was about to tell him off for being a creep and watching girls pee in the dark, when I started to realize that a few fundamental things about what I was looking at were wrong. This was not Alex. This was not Alex. This was not Alex. The boy's eyes flickered in the beam from my flashlight, like a deer or a cat's does when they cross headlight beams on the road. There was this gold fluorescence to it that human eyes just can't produce. I remember standing there for some time, staring at him as my mind put the puzzle together. The length of time I stood there, staring, is the single detail that I can attribute to knowing that this really happened to me, that this was real. When years later, all I can think about is that science must have to have an answer to this, that this universe is so huge that we know so little about things that I know what I saw, but still, there has to be some kind of rational explanation. But when I looked at him, and he looked back at me so directly, so incredibly aware of me, and I of him, I realized I could see the trees behind him. I could see through his body. I could see through him, and he was smiling at me, and we were lost. There's a great quality to fear when it becomes that incredibly intense, which makes you entirely lose your grasp of time. All I know is that I dropped everything in my hands, my toilet paper, my flashlight, and I ran away through the dark. And before I knew it, I was lost in the woods. I have no concept of how long I ran alone in the dark. I have never been this scared in my life, and I pray that I never will be again. Everything gets distorted. Time, breath, space, thought. I don't remember screaming either, but apparently I was. I screamed loud enough that a friend woke up and came to find me, popping unexpectedly from behind a bush and scaring the shit out of me all over again. The one miracle I can attest to is this. I never actually peed my pants, though I think in this situation it would have been justified. Back at camp, I tried to wake up the girls. I cried and begged for them to listen to me, that I had just seen a ghost, and that we needed to get out of here, because he was out there, like really out there, like right over there out there. But trying to wake up a groggy 14-year-old girl after a vigorous day of physical work in the hot sun is like trying to push a boulder back up the side of a cliff. The ones that bothered to wake up enough to listen were angry, accusing me of causing trouble for no reason. And so, I just climbed back into my sleeping bag in the middle of the tarp, pulled the hood up, and didn't sleep. Instead, I went on a silent, terrified night watch, until pink kissed the sky and finally brought some relief. But before that, when I laid in my sleeping bag all the rest of that night, made worse by the tarp being completely open to the surrounding woods, I'm sure that I heard footsteps circling around us just behind the tree line. The constant crunch, crunch, crunch of 2 bare feet in the underbrush. The next morning, when I retold my story to anyone who would listen, a few shy girls told me that they too had heard footsteps in the woods. When the sun was at its morning brightest, after wrestling with myself about it, I finally returned to the rock I had found the boy sitting on. I stood on it and looked around at the ground. The dirt was scattered with rusting shotgun shells. That day, we got back on our boats and followed the river back to familiar territory. I don't have any recollection of where this site was, or if I could indeed ever find it again, though I know I would never want to. The campers teased me and drew pictures of ghosts and laughed, and it became another camp story. The counselors markedly didn't say anything about it. Nothing. Not one single word. We made it back to camp safely on the 3rd day, and my story blended into the background of everything else about that place. I'm not religious, opting instead for hard scientific evidence to move my heart and thoughts. But what I can't explain is this story. Because this story, what I encountered, is absolutely a true story.